thank you for your presentation and for the opportunity of Rachel Carson to present my work. More than 50% of the world population lives today in urban areas, and 60 to 80% of the energy use is consumed in urban areas. So for me, this is brings two big motivations to conduct such a study in long-run energy transitions. One is a kind of policy motivation. So I believe that energy history can provide interesting insights on the drivers of energy transitions, and especially so now that cities have a more importance in climate mitigation policies, with countries dropping out from agreements. The second one is that urbanization is indissociable of the process of industrialization that many countries occur. So, and this was accompanied by a transition from biomass to fossil fuels. Therefore, if we want to understand how the process come about, it's essential to look into these relations. So, to help you think about these relationships, you can see like a city like an organism. So this is like the concept of urban metabolism. So the city needs like fuels, it needs food, and it needs materials in order to grow. So the city needs these resources from both the hinterland or from external trade. And this is like the mechanism that makes then industrialization and to growth. And in order to increase this consumption or increase population growth, you either need to increase agriculture productivity, or you need to go from renewable energy sources as biomass to fossil fuels. So I'm kind of interested in quantifying this kind of relationships, as Christopher said. Okay, so let's see the case of Lisbon from 1854 to 2006. The main aim of my work today is to analyze the drivers of energy transitions in Lisbon over this period of 150 years. There is very few other case studies of cities, so basically that use a quantitative approach. So basically it's Vienna and Paris, and they are both recent studies. So I think Lisbon could provide like an interesting case, not only because I have the sources to quantify this, but also because it's totally different from Vienna and Paris, both in terms of climate, as Christopher said, it has a warm climate. In terms of economics, so Portugal basically only developed after the 1960s, and Lisbon is the capital of Portugal. Portugal doesn't have coal, but Lisbon, it has a particular geography because it has the sea. So you can see here that it is situated in this estuario of Tagus. And then here you have the Atlantic Sea and all the connections to imports, which make Lisbon like the pithead of Portugal, basically, but also like an interesting case if you want to quantify, because it's both a receiver of materials and energy, but it's also like it also functions as a transporter of energy to other parts of the country that are not well provided. Okay, so what are the main research questions of the project that I'm conducting in Rachel Carson? How can we characterize the Lisbon energy transition from a biomass-based society to a fossil fuel one? So how fast was it? Can we quantify it? Can we say something about drivers of main energy transitions, but not only on aggregate, but also looking to sectors, looking into households? What were the main drivers for fulfill the energy service of heating or lighting or the industry? What were the main drivers for fulfilling the energy service of power? So, and with this, maybe say something about the future. I'm also interested to know who are the main suppliers of energy to the city of Lisbon and how this changed, how the areas change of supplying, and maybe how much was the environmental impact. And finally, I'm also interested in a comparative approach, which I'm not going to talk so much today, but I want to later compare the Lisbon energy transition with other capitals' energy transitions. And also to the energy transition that occurred in Portugal, which I tell you, it was very, very slow. So it's a remarkable country that never had coal as the main energy carrier, and that's like almost unique in Europe. Okay. So this is the object of our study. This is Lisbon area. And in order to make this quantification, I'm like only considering like the area of 1895, which is basically the area that Lisbon is today, like is administrative limits. So Lisbon basically in 1852 was just like here in, was just covering the center of Lisbon. And then it changed for fiscal reasons, as we are going to see later. This is just the city today, because there are, of course, a lot of urban sprawling, but it kind of represents very well the limits of the city until more or less 1970s. So I'm going to show here the Lisbon population. The one that I'm considering is the one from 1895. There it's in black. And here you can see that the population increased until circa 800,000 people in the 1970s. And then it has decreased so far. And that's basically because it has moved to other suburban areas that are not in the limit of Lisbon. But that's basically just mostly since the 1980s. Okay, so which kind of methods do I use to quantify? And I hope I don't scare with this. I'm going to say it in a very simple way. I use 3 indicators because boundaries are very important when you look into cities. So I use the indicator of final energy consumption, the indicator of domestic energy consumption, and total energy requirements. Final energy consumption is just basically all the fuels that we as consumers use. So it's the fuels that reach the consumer in order to provide energy services for households, industry, and transportation. This can be measured in calorific terms or in joules, like we have discussed. But this is not all the impact in the city. So you also have energy conversion losses inside the city, and this could be, for example, a power central of gas or of electricity that converts coal into electricity and gas. And you also have energy conversion losses outside the city, and this could be, for example, the process of making charcoal, which requires 1 ton of charcoal requires 5 tons of wood. So this could be like all energy conversion losses outside the city. So this is basically 3 indicators that express consumption in Lisbon. Okay. What are the sources that I use to study energy transitions in Lisbon? Okay, I must say that it's important to refer that this project has actually really a multiplicity of sources, And it would actually be impossible to do this project if I haven't done the construction of the database for Portugal myself, because I use transportation statistics, import statistics, the consumption tax, utility statistics, industrial census, agriculture statistics, and then sometimes I even need to use proxies to know which is the consumption of Lisbon for a particular energy service. I'm just going to talk here a little bit about a source that I think is particularly fascinating, and then I'm using to construct this database. This source is called the Imposto do Consumo, so like consumption tax. And it was basically a tax that was done to products that would enter the city. So on both food products, it included food products, and it included also some energy products like fuel wood, charcoal, lightning oils, and coke. It had origin in 1845 during the liberal reforms, and we have like records from 1847 to 1922, so it is an amazing source to actually cover energy consumption in Lisbon. And this was basically like a road that would circulate around the city with a lot of toll points. So for example here you can see like what it is. This is just where I live actually, a very ugly place where I live, not so beautiful Lisbon, but it's like a bit suburban from Lisbon. So this part here is just it's Lisbon, and this part is Amadora, which is another municipality, and it's how it looks today. Nobody knew that this was a fiscal point until they constructed the roundabout. So yeah, okay. So I show you now the key findings of this work, so of the energy transitions in Lisbon. The first key finding is, of course, that in aggregate terms, final energy consumption increased impressively. So you can see from like 5 to 50 petajoules along the time. We can see as well that the differences between the three indicators, so at the first time, actually the energy losses inside the city are preponderant, and that's because of the gas factory and the electricity power central that are inside the city. And nowadays, basically since the 1950s or somehow, like most of the losses are outside the city, and that's because the power generation is outside the city. Here you can see the total energy requirements per capita. So how does it look energy per person? And what you can see here is actually that the transition to coal is kind of fast and almost in a kind of one go, right? So basically, since coal can be imported in black, it gets like the main energy carrier of Lisbon, and that's like a bit opposing to the rest of the country. And here you see like that it increases until 30 gigajoules per capita until 1913. After the wars it decreases and then increases enormously in the 1960s, just as it happened with Portugal. The transition to coal is even more, you can see even better if you see the share of coal in energy carriers. In black as well, you can see here that coal is 60 to 70% of the final energy consumption of Lisbon. And then there is a very quick transition to oil in the 1950s, to oil as road fuels, basically transportation. Okay, so these are the main key findings of the database. But what are the interesting points? So what are the drivers of energy transitions per sector? One thing that we know is that the industrial transition for coal is very, very, very fast. So basically, Lisbon is not Manchester, but it's the Manchester of Portugal, not like in an energy-intensive way, but basically 80% of the industry in Portugal is situated in the city in the beginning of this period. And even in 1913, it's like 40%, just in one city, in whole Portugal. Representative maybe of 10% of the population. So basically, new industries situated along the river, cotton, textiles, food industries, and this is much faster than in all other regions, and this is because basically it's the pithead. Lisbon is the pithead of Portugal. And although it still buys coal at 3 times more expensive than it is in England, it's an industrialization still. Okay, the second thing is that what makes Lisbon different from Portugal is the share of modern energy. And here you can see the different trends. Modern energy is like coal, oil, electricity, and traditional energy is like firewood. So it's like having a country in 2 speeds, like Lisbon industrial, but Portugal basically consuming household food and rural. It's like a country at basically 2 speeds. Differently from industry, the household energy transition is actually very slow and it's non-linear, so it doesn't go biomass, coal, oil, as you would expect, but it goes more like biomass, coal, biomass, oil. So, and that's like kind of interesting. So basically, like Christopher presented, oh sorry. Lisbon doesn't need so much wood for heating, but however they need for cooking. After the earthquake, actually, most of the houses, they didn't have fireplace because people were afraid that would be like some kind of fire. So most of the houses in Pombalina, Lisbon, didn't have fireplace. So what you will do? Okay, I messed up. Okay. So what will you use is this like fogareiro or little stove with charcoal, and people will not even have like proper stoves. So before the arrival of coal, like you have like wood coming from these areas, but then you also have like charcoal coming from areas like along the river. And this was a process that was very costly, and that that took a long time. Like so, it took more than 2 weeks sometimes to arrive to the destination in upstream. Okay, you would expect that as industry, household transition would occur and that they would go to coal immediately, right? But actually, this doesn't really happen. So coal and coke, it was actually sold at a much lower price than charcoal. So this is the difference. Charcoal was sold like 3 times more expensive than coal and 2 times more expensive than coke. Coal, like households didn't want it to use, basically. They thought it was anti-hygienic. Coke, they could use it if there was this kind of price difference. Okay. But there was a transition to coke, but we can see that charcoal consumption supply does not decline. It declines a bit in per capita terms until First World War, but if you see in terms of absolute terms, it doubles until 1913 and then triples in the 20s and the 30s. So why is that? Actually, it's an interesting insight, I think, a message that the new fossil fuel technology increased the supply of the old renewable ones. So when the railways come, they didn't come arriving with coal to other destinations of Portugal, mineral coal, but they also provide other parts of Portugal which were which had forests, cork tree forests, and were able now to actually produce charcoal for the Lisbon market. And 80% of the coal and charcoal that are transported in railways are actually for the Lisbon market. It's charcoal. And Lisboners prefer it quite a lot. So the regions shift from the riverside to the railway site. Another insight from the household transition is that crises and public policies were stronger drivers of energy transitions. And here you can see the share of final energy consumption for different household fuels in Lisbon. You can see that charcoal loses ground for coke in 1913, and then you have the war. So you have the First World War. The First World War shuts basically the gas factory because coal has to be imported. Then what do households do? They start to consume more charcoal again. So in the 1930s, actually, charcoal was again the most important energy carrier in Portugal. And in the 1930s, it was not defined which was going to be the most important fuel for cooking for households. Actually, the gas factory had a lot of problems in advertising gas consumption, and tried to advertisement saying like, okay, this is all technology, this is dirty, let's go and consume gas. But it was very slow, the shift to gas during this period. Again, in the World War II, again, so another war. So here you see how the prices were of the different fuels, and you can see that they were more or less the same price for cooking expenses for a family of four in 1936. In 1943, it's actually gas that is the cheaper. And how is the gas the cheaper? Basically because the company agree with the government to cross-subsidize gas while keeping the price of electricity very high, because the company had both gas and electricity. So you can see here that the price of electricity goes up, the price of gas keeps the same, and of course the price of charcoal that goes to industry or wood that has to be deviated for industry reasons goes up as well. And so you see that gas prices actually are the best fuel in the war for the people. And then you see here, after the Second World War, a big shift in the household market into favor of more modern fuels. Another interesting message from this talk is that the service transition that occurred in 1980s actually increased energy consumption in Lisbon. So you have the same process of deindustrialization that you have in other cities, and here you can see Lisbon industrial energy as a share of the district and as a share of the country reducing since basically the 1930s, but mostly 1970s. But at the same time, as you have this service transition where today 80% of the people work for services, you have an enormous increase in the consumption of energy per capita from 28 gigajoules to 58 gigajoules. And that's basically a lot to do with transport. So transport is the big problem of Lisbon now. Like the service transition is accompanied by a transport transition that is very energy intensive. So what does the future bring? I don't know, like, is it a sustainable Lisbon? Is it an unsustainable Lisbon? Lisbon ranks very poorly in most comparatively city environmental indexes, and there are a lot of environmental indexes, and especially poor in transport related issues. So one thing that people criticize is that there is an enormous amount of cars that enter the city every day, and basically double the population of Lisbon. Lisbon still has a high share of public transport, but it seems that this brings a lot of pressure in terms of emissions and pollution inside the city. It has also like a relatively low share of walking and biking together compared with other cities in Europe. So biking is only 1%. But I don't know, like I left Lisbon in 2006, and I still see some changes, but maybe these changes are just average, the changes that are happening in other cities. So for example, I see, okay, sorry. So for sorry, this will be cut, right? So I see these power chargers. They are just across my street, but almost no electrical cars to charge, one or two maybe. I also see like there is an enormous investment in bike paths. In 2006 there was basically none. Now I can bike to the National Library when I'm there, and I encounter maybe 10 people. It's 6 kilometers, by the way. And Lisboners speak also a lot in running. Running, it's something that is common to other cities, but they really picked in running, and there are a lot of spaces, green spaces to do that. And also, like the riverside region is very beautiful now. So, like the port of Lisbon went away and was substituted by this, like nice walking, running, cycling path that stretches for 8 kilometers. So, I don't know, but it is something for discussion, maybe. So. With this, I want to finish my talk and just trying to put everything together. What I think is interesting from seeing this energy transition in Lisbon. Geography and preferences of consumers determined a lot the transitions. And we can see these transitions at two different speeds. We can see different speeds in the Portugal and different speeds in Lisbon, being very fast in Lisbon and not so fast in Portugal. We can see also two speeds in industry and in the households. We can also see that the dependence of imported energy impacted the energy transitions of the city in a significant way. So this can be actually hopeful for the future, because it's like the crisis foster transitions. So maybe crisis can foster transitions now to a more renewable future. But we have to be cautious, because the transition from industry to services was accompanied by a very fast rise in energy consumption per capita in the city. Okay, so as Lisbon is open to the sea, I am also open to your questions, and thank you for your attention.